really great to have you all here. There's a bunch of you online as well, so it's great to have you in the room. I think it just started raining, right? As you're arriving, so wouldn't you rather be here than out in the rain? But even better than that, we've got Shamubeel Eaqub here who's going to be sharing with us. And the way that this is going to work is that he's going to come up and run through a presentation about this report, which has come out recently looking at social cohesion. And then what we're going to do is sit down together. If we had a fire here, it would be a fireside chat. And I'm going to ask him some questions. I don't think I've met all of you yet, but at some point, no doubt we will. And if I do ever meet you, you'll hear me talk about Seeds podcast. So that's a labor of love I've been doing now for about 8 years with 440 conversations. So this conversation will become another episode of Seeds podcast as well. So that will be the format, a bit of a Q&A back and forth with Shamubeel. We would welcome your questions, so be storing them up. I think what we'll do is wait until the end after we've had a bit of a dialogue back and forth. But for those of you online, I'm looking at the camera, feel free in the chat as we're going. You can put your questions, and we'll do our best to get to them. I can guarantee you that we're not going to get to all of them, but maybe, Shamubeel, we can have a chat and see if we can answer them. Because I've got the emails and the contact details for everyone, so we can maybe follow up with some, here was the question we didn't get to, and here's some thoughts and responses. So the point of this is, don't hold back on your questions. Type them in the chat, we will definitely have a look at them. So Shamubeel, I've been lucky enough to know you for a number of years. People may not know, but we were on a board together, which was all about community housing. It's for an initiative called Community Finance. So the last few years we've been together in many strategy meetings, and I've always appreciated the clarity of thought that you bring to everything and the way that you express yourself and get concepts across. So it's really fortunate. I don't really need to introduce you very much because I think everyone knows who you are, but really appreciate the time that you're taking to come. I know you've spoken in Auckland and Wellington, now you're here in the South Island as well, in the best city in the country. And actually, I think you have Southern roots as well, right? So having gone to Lincoln and grown up there. So I'm going to hand over to Shamubeel and let him run through his presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation about some of the themes that emerge, looking from an intergenerational perspective as well. Thank you very much. Let's give him a roll.
Thank you, Stephen. Look, it is really wonderful to be here. So I went to high school and university at Lincoln, so it's nice to be home. The purpose of this work was, over the course of the last 20 years, I've been doing a lot of work in public policy, but in the last 10 years in particular, what I've noticed is it's hard for us to get enduring policies. Our governments, our leaders are constantly doing the flip-flop, right? They'll start one thing and the next lot will come along and change it. And I don't think we should blame our politicians or our leaders. I think it reflects us that we can't decide what we want. So that was the purpose behind this, and notwithstanding this tragedy that took place in Christchurch, this social cohesion is happening, this lack of social cohesion, the polarization is happening around the world. In the UK, they also went through their own issues with the riots and things like that, and they've been running this, social cohesion kind of reviews every few years. And the last one was called the Calm Review, and it talked about these issues that felt very familiar to New Zealand. But one thing that she's talked about was really, I think, pertinent for me, is that we all have these solutions to fix social cohesion, but we don't know the state of social cohesion. Right? We don't know where we are in terms of actual social cohesion, but we've all got solutions that we're pursuing. So one of our big recommendations was, can we please get a consistent measure of understanding where we're at and how that's changing, so that the actions that we take, the policies that we pursue, the things we do are fit for purpose. So New Zealand is exactly the same in that we've talked about a lot about the risks to social cohesion, the potentials for polarization, but we don't know for sure where they might sit. And so that was the motivation for me to go, why can't we find out? So Australia has been running the survey for a number of years now, and they've been tracking it over time. It's not perfect, but it's consistent and it's contextual. It helps us get a sense of where things are at. So I went to the Tyndall Foundation and said, can you give me some money to do this? And he said, yeah, okay. I'll give you 5 years to do 5 surveys. So this is what that is. So we got money from Tyndall Foundation, the Top Foundation, the J. McKinsey Trust, and NetSafe to do this piece of work. Talbot Mills, who are a polling company, did the research, the market research for us at a discount, and my business and Helen Clark Foundation threw in all their efforts for free because it's important. I was doing a piece of work in the Two-Way Fund. It was all around imagining tikanga in economic development. And when I was doing that piece of work, I was very confident, right? Because I'm an economist, so you essentially exude confidence, not always justified by knowledge. So I was there and I said, look, if we want to talk about economic development for the people of Tuhoe, we should be talking about the gates and ladders, the bad things that are holding you back. Let's stop doing those and really pile into those ladders that are positive things that will make things better. Tamati was a very scary individual if you haven't met him. He sat back for a little while and said, Shamubeel, you missed the most important thing, unity. If people are not together and if you haven't taken them with you along the journey, those gates and ladders will not last. They will change. People will think, one group will think the ladder is the gate, another group will think the gate is the ladder. And you're going to find this constant chop and change. And that is what we're observing in politics today in New Zealand, what we're observing in politics in the US, UK, Europe, in terms of whether it's Brexit or what Trump is doing, or the vandalism that's going on in many parts of governments around the world. It's possible for us to think of specific policies that might work, but they're not enduring positive change. For all of us, what we want is, we want policies and actions that are good for most New Zealanders. We're not going to get it right for everyone, but we need to get it right at least for most New Zealanders, so the changes that we make, the actions that we take, are enduring and positive. But for that to happen, we must be a cohesive society, because otherwise it's very hard for us to find a common purpose. In my head, at least, we've got countries that are very polarized, and I think some expressions of the polarizations are things like Brexit, the actions of Trump. But we also see the reactions to that in places like Canada and Australia, who say, we don't want that kind of polarization in our country. Those countries are also not fully cohesive. I'll say they're more fractured rather than cohesive, because the same kind of tensions have been building in those places. So this is the continuum in my head. There are communities that are cohesive, there are communities that are polarized, and there's probably somewhere in between where there is fracturing, where we are probably more polarized within groups rather than between groups. Does that make sense? That just because you're brown doesn't mean all brown people think the same. It's that there is a difference of views within these different parts of society. That's the broad frame, and my sense of the data is that we are increasingly a fractured society. And this is really based on the data that we have observed from the survey, and what we did was we compared ourselves to Australia, because we like to compare ourselves to Australia, right? The great rivalry, whether it's rugby or a pavlova, it turns out, on this score at least, they're winning. So we measured 5 big domains. The first one was around sense of belonging. Do you feel a sense of belonging to the country? Do you feel a sense of belonging in your community? Are your neighbors, approachable? Do you feel safe? Those kinds of questions. Sense of worth. Do you feel like you are valued? Do you feel lonely? Do you feel connected? Those kinds of questions. Social inclusion and justice. Do you feel like the courts are, working on your behalf? Can you trust those kinds of things? Participation. Do you go out and participate in religion or community groups or social groups? Do you vote? An interesting stat, because we've got local government elections coming up. 2/3 of people claim to vote in local elections, but the actual reality is 1/3 of people actually vote. So we lie a lot in these kinds of things. So take this stuff with a little bit of caution. So participation is actually really, really low. The other part that we looked at was around acceptance and rejection of ideas like religion, other people's views, their ethnicity, their color, those kinds of things. And in all of those instances, New Zealand was worse than Australia. And with the exception of one thing, we protested a lot more last year. But that's not surprising with the Treaty Principles Bill. Because of that, we saw a huge amount of protest activity, which was of course the right thing to do, because that is our democratic right. So there is a bit of a gap, and it's not to say that we are absolutely terrible. You can see across those pictures that by and large we are quite similar with Australia. But if you look at the trend of Australia over the course of the last 20 years, it's been going down. And that fills me with a little bit of concern that we are probably seeing the same kind of erosion of confidence, erosion of trust, and that fills me with a bit of fear. Now, this is a very busy picture, but essentially what we were trying to look at was what are the kinds of things that explain the difference in views? Where are the ideas, where are the perceptions of society, where are they most diverged? What kind of attributes explain that? And the most important and the most critical part of that was poverty. Those people who are hungry, those people who don't have access to resources, were angry and they were discontent, and it's not surprising. They don't trust our institutions, they don't trust each other, they don't trust community groups, they don't feel like they belong, they're stressed, they're hungry, all of those kinds of things. But it plays out in that they have this legitimate discontent with the way things are. And what we find is they are the people who are most likely to say, democracy doesn't work for me, our politicians can't be trusted, our courts can't be trusted, I don't vote, I don't participate, right? It becomes a self-perpetuating thing. But it's not just politics, it's also political views. We're becoming more and more entrenched. If you're in this one political tribe, you must believe all of their tribal view. But that's not true, right? I mean, you've met our politicians. You can't take them at face value. They'll change their minds tomorrow. So it's really important we understand that while we can, of course, vote in elections in particular ways, we can't be uncritical in thinking about politics. But it turns out the political views are becoming more entrenched, and some of those division is showing up in the data through that lens. The other part we see is around unemployment and people who are working part-time. So when we talk about poverty, I think it's easy to think about people who are homeless or people who are on welfare. But a huge amount of poverty in New Zealand are people who are working poor. In fact, that is the largest group of New Zealanders who are poor. They have jobs, they're working bloody hard, but they can't get ahead. So 50% of New Zealanders tell us that hard work pays, and 50% of New Zealanders tell us hard work doesn't pay. It's not that they're not working hard. What they're experiencing is they work hard, but they can't get ahead. There are also two other things that describe some forms of polarization, not on everything, but some things. One was around ethnicity. Some groups just experienced more discrimination, or they had stronger views around certain things, and around age. Younger people in particular were far more likely to feel unhappy, lonely, disconnected than older people. So something's happening for a number of different reasons, including economic security, social media, information disinformation, all of those things are coming across in terms of why that might be happening. But it wasn't all bad. I think there's a reason why I did this piece of work is I'm fundamentally optimistic about the future of New Zealand. I think there's a lot to protect. And there are some positives, but even in the positives, there are some risks. The most positive finding in the survey was 80% of New Zealanders really had a sense of belonging to our country. And that's good. The idea of our nation, of the belonging in this country was extremely high, very comparable to Australia. But when you come down to the more local level, only 2/3 thought that neighbors would help each other. That's extraordinary, right? A third of people didn't think they could rely on their neighbors for getting their cup of sugar or helping them out to look after their kid, right? Which wasn't how I grew up. In Lincoln, when my parents went shopping, they never thought twice about asking the neighbor across the fence to watch out first, right? 57% of New Zealanders think courts are fair. We're doing better than Australia, but 57%, that means 43% don't think courts are fair. That's an extraordinary statistic to me. In fact, the same number think elections are not fair. These are critical institutions that we need to maintain trust in, because if you don't believe our courts are fair, if our institutions are fair, if our elections are fair, are we really going to trust the people who are in power? Of course not. So it's not surprising that we're seeing this kind of level of discontent. And as I mentioned before, 51% of New Zealanders say that hard work brings a better life. But that means roughly half of New Zealanders are saying hard work does not bring a better life. The disappointments for me were, I guess, the calls to action. These are the things that I looked at and I was like, wow, I was really shocked. In fact, the first time I got this data set, I had to walk away from it because some of the data was just so troubling. I was really shocked that 1/4 of New Zealanders sometimes or often go without meals because they don't have enough money. 1/4 of New Zealanders. Isn't that shocking? This expansion of poverty, it's not inequality, this is poverty, right? If you can't feed yourself, it's poverty. And that's really troubling. It was most prevalent, of course, amongst Maori, Pacifica, unemployed, people under 30. These are all the usual groups that we know. But it's not surprising then, when you've got that kind of poverty, that a third of New Zealanders support a strong leader. A strong leader who doesn't have to go through the usual checks and balances. Did you see the lack of checks and balances when it came to pay equity the other day? It's very easy to attack our institutions and lose trust, very hard to win it back. When it comes to the trust in strong leaders, it was very prevalent amongst Asians, amongst Maori, amongst poor, and amongst the rich. There were very few things where the rich and poor agreed. There's this one thing where they had a little bit of unity. So apparently it turns out both the rich people and the poor people think that maybe we just sidestep all those pesky democratic checks and balances, we can just get things done. That is not a good way to do things. A third of New Zealanders are happy with their financial situation. In Australia, it's double that. Nearly half of women don't feel safe walking alone at night. 55% of women don't feel safe walking alone at night. And it's much more prevalent amongst young women, amongst students, surprisingly amongst retired people and amongst New Zealand First voters and amongst the poor. And the last one, which is quite pertinent to me because I'm an immigrant, 49% of New Zealanders do not think that immigrants make good citizens. In Australia, that's 8%. To flip it around, 92% of Australians think immigrants make good citizens. In New Zealand, it's 51%. This worries me because, yes, I'm an immigrant, but my children who are born here, who look a little bit like me and half like my wife, of course, are they going to be treated as immigrants? And are they going to be treated with discrimination because they look different? Are we really talking about immigration, or is it just thinly veiled racism? You won't be surprised to see that those views are much more prominent amongst New Zealand First voters, ACT voters, people who are unemployed, people who are at home, people who are poor, and people who are Maori. Now, the reason I tell you this is because it's very easy to go, it's only those people who are, so let's say, New Zealand First voters. But it's wrong. This discontent is held much more widely across society. And we need to confront these confronting statistics because what it tells us is there is something wrong. We have lost the social license to run the kind of immigration policy that we have run over the course of the last couple of decades. So what? It's not about being the same. The reason why I'm so happy to come here and so happy to have these conversations around the country is because New Zealand our glory is in our diversity. We have so much wonderful diversity in the way that we look, the way that we think, in our age groups and all of those kinds of things. It's not about being the same. It's about being able to come together to have difficult conversations and to do it in a civil and respectful way. That's what social cohesion means. It's not about wishing away confrontation. It's not about wishing away politics. Those are things that are actually really important processes for us able to find where those common areas are. If we don't approach each other with the ability to listen, we will not be able to find common ground because conversation is the only thing that will get us there. There are a few things we could do. So in this survey, we haven't done two things. What we haven't done is we haven't found out why people hold these views. That's a project for next year. And the project for the year after that will be what can we do about it? What are the kinds of ways we can talk about social cohesion and the actions we take? It was very deliberate. The reason why we did it this way is because I didn't have enough money. So I was very financially constrained in doing this project, so we're taking it in turns. But it will come. But the literature gives us a few ideas in terms of things that could help. One is around leadership. Our leaders could be more like statesmen rather than sowers of division. Be more like the Pope and less like Trump. But also, we should be thinking about political processes. It's not just about politics, it's about the process. Politics and the process of government can be really helpful things that can help us negotiate and find ways that, areas that we agree. So I was talking to the Christchurch City Council folk earlier today, and I gave the example of what happened after the earthquake in Canterbury. The Greater Christchurch Partnership had built up this plan of where the future land would go, where the infrastructure would go, and it was just stuck in the Environment Court, right? And what did Jerry Brownlee do? He stopped the litigation, but most New Zealanders kind of agreed on the broad plan of what needed to happen. And that's what we implemented in that period after the earthquake. And it kind of worked. We need to do it again, and unfortunately, I don't think we have enough of the plan for the next phase of economic and housing growth in Canada. So political processes can be very useful ways to find a broad level of understanding across broad groups of New Zealanders. But there are also a few individual things we can do. The first is around what we're doing today, which is around awareness. Just understanding that maybe New Zealand is not so egalitarian, maybe we're not so nice people, maybe there are some divisions, and we should confront it. The second is around holding up a mirror and asking, how often when I see somebody else, I see a stereotype versus an individual. It's so easy when we engage in a conversation to go, I know what kind of person you are. You must be the kind of person who's brown, who's educated, so you probably hold these views, right? It's like if you say you're an economist or an accountant, people assume that you're some kind of right-wing nut job, right? Maybe not. Maybe some of us are left-wing nut jobs, right? So stereotypes can be quite harmful. And the big ask of you is, can we make active choices for one positive contact every day? And what I mean by that is that one interaction where it's about listening rather than trying to converse somebody. So much of our life on social media and other places is now becoming about converting people to our point of view, strongly and staunchly defending our viewpoint, rather than a place where we can have respectful conversation. I was on Q&A, and I guess the line that I use is, when we have those positive contacts, what we're doing is we're conversing, what we're not doing is conversing. I invite you to try and listen. I'm going to leave you with one picture that I really, really like. This is also the end result of that work I did with the folk in Tuhoe. On the right-hand side is the image of success from the people of Tuhoe. On the left-hand side is the image of success from my friends in the government departments in Wellington. They're both beautiful mountains, but they're different mountains. The pictures of success, the words we describe to where we want to get to, may be the same, but actually what we're driving to might be different. If you don't take the time to converse and talk to each other to really understand what we talk about when it comes to our vision, our values, our perceptions, our dreams and hopes, we are actually maybe not even talking about the same kinds of things. So I'll leave it there for you to contemplate those two pictures, because I think what we'll find is, even in this conversation, many of the things I've talked about in terms of what a cohesive New Zealand looks like, my picture might be different from your picture. But if we talk and if we converse, maybe we'll come closer together. Thank you.
Just a reminder, the format is we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to some questions. And for those of you online, we'd love to have them coming through in the chat. That would be great. My name is Stephen Moe, and I'm a partner at this law firm, Perryfield Lawyers. I know this isn't kind of a legal topic, but we really want to get out and have impact in society itself. And this seems like it's a really important conversation. So that's kind of the background, like, why is a law firm helping to organize this? So, Shamubeel, I'm going to take a seat here, and we're going to have a conversation. I could start with a tell us about the positives of things, but I think it's important that we begin with the frank discussion about the negative side. We'll get to some positives as well, but on the podcast I do Seeds, I remember I was talking with somebody who had come as an immigrant from the islands and was based in Auckland. And she described how her lunch, she would get her one piece of bread and cut it in the middle. That was for breakfast. For lunch, she would cut the edges off, and at dinner, she would try to make it into a circle. So her food that day was 3 pieces of bread. And I just wonder if you can speak to maybe an illusion that some of us would have about how prosperous we actually are, and then the poverty that actually exists within society.
Yeah, what a great image. Well, not a great image, what a stark image that you paint, Stephen. And I think that is exactly right. I think for most of us, it's very hard to imagine not having food in the pantry or the fridge, right? And that's what you'd expect, hope for most people. The data was very confronting for me because I did not expect that a quarter of New Zealanders would be going hungry sometimes or often. But it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, because I've been looking at other data for the last few years that we've been seeing that New Zealanders are just skipping on fresh food, right? Like whether it's fruit, vegetables, meat, eggs, people have been reducing their consumption of those kinds of things quite significantly, and I thought maybe that was just a quirk. Maybe it's just for one-off reasons. For example, when it comes to fruit, for the last 30 years, 80 to 90% of households in New Zealand would buy fruit every week. In 23, it was 60%. 40% of New Zealanders did not buy fruit in a given week. Isn't it shocking? How are we feeding our families if they're not getting fresh fruit, fresh veggies, all that kind of stuff? So the experience of poverty is more, I think, wider than some people might think. And it's because, like I said before, sometimes it's easy to think poverty is the rough sleeper on the street. It might be the person on the welfare because our welfare system is extremely mean and grudging. But it's also your picture, Stephen. There's a whole bunch of people who are working poor in New Zealand where the income is simply not sufficient, mainly because so much of the money is taken up by housing and transport. You know, those basics of life, you know, if you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when you try and do those things, food actually isn't the first one. You have to do the shelter and the transport to be able to earn money, to be able to feed yourself. So it's quite shocking to me that, you know, we're seeing this happening at the moment. And I mentioned before, I was very upset with the pay equity stuff that's just taken place in Parliament this week. Because to think that somehow underpaying our women in teaching and in aged care and in health is somehow make us a more prosperous country is frankly bullshit. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Stephen, but poverty is real in New Zealand, and it's probably expanded in a way that I had not expected.
No, that's where I wanted to get to, because I think even for those of us who have the ability to make a choice that on a Friday we will come and listen to you talk, you know, like the fact that we are here puts us into a privileged position. The people who can afford a computer to be watching something online, you know, it's really interesting to me because I think we can sometimes not realize that this is actually happening within our own society.
Absolutely. I did on the back of this report, I did an event with a youth group in South Auckland, and there was a lot of poverty, but there was also a lot of love, and there was also a lot of network and a lot of community. And in fact, in some of the poorer communities, the community networks are stronger because they must be. But it can go either way. In many poor communities, either is much stronger or is much poorer. So it's that bifurcation that happens that's the scary part. So I don't have an answer in terms of where this goes, but I would like to go. One, we need to give every New Zealand dignity. We are capable of doing that. We're actually a rich enough country that we could do this if we wanted to. We can't always ask governments because sometimes the politics won't work. But I think we can, at least as business leaders, as civic leaders, we can do what we can in our own domains.
I want to stay in the negative territory. We will get to the positive, I promise. You were talking about immigrants and the attitude to immigrants. And as you heard, as I opened my mouth, I have an accent as well. I happen to come from America. My father had a job as a marine biologist, which is what brought us here way back in 1983. So I actually grew up here. But because of my accent, people make assumptions quite often. Let's just go a little bit deeper there, because I can tell that this is personal for you as well. Yeah, unpack a little bit more, like what was your reaction when you got these findings? How did it make you feel?
Look, I mean, I am a first-generation migrant, and I was thinking about not just myself, but I was thinking more about my children, right? These are kids who have been born here, but they look like me and my wife. My wife is a third-generation Chinese. And so, you know, they definitely look like migrants in Auckland, right? And so, to me, it's like I looked at the data and went, surely there's a mistake. So I asked the guys at the survey company, can you make sure that you haven't stuffed this up? And they hadn't. And that was quite confronting because essentially, I think what it says is, people like me may not be welcome in this country, right? So if half of New Zealanders don't want me here, what does that mean? And then you go out and think about, well, what does it mean for society? What must have happened to these people to think that people who look a little bit different from me are the ones to blame for their misfortune? What is it that they're experiencing today that feels like it's a zero-sum game, that by that person having prosperity, I'm poor? And it is the zero-sum mentality that I think we see in this immigration narrative is, if those people come here, they're taking our jobs, they're taking our incomes, they're taking our opportunities. And you know what, there might be a little bit of truth to that. The fact that we have a housing crisis is not just because we have planning failures, it's also because we've got population growth that's been the strongest we've had in centuries, right? We've imported something like, close to 700,000 to 800,000 people over the course of the last decade, it has significant effects on the demands of our infrastructure, both physical and social. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on at the same time, but as an individual, it feels very confronting to think that somebody who's lived here for most of their working life, they are probably not accepted for who they are.
No, it's definitely confronting, and for me as well, thinking about people as they arrive, how do I make them feel welcome as well, which is totally kind of the flip side of that. I want to ask you a question, and I would like to think that there's an answer to this, but I'm not sure exactly if we've crafted the answer yet. And that is, you mentioned some of the issues which we're facing as a society are so difficult that I wonder if we need to take it out of the politicians' hands. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. You'll know where I'm going with this. Housing, health, education. Like those 3 things shouldn't be subject to flip-flops every couple of years. And I just wonder, just to have a conversation on this, I'm going to propose something, but would it be possible, or what would it look like if we took those 3 core things, maybe add infrastructure in as well, I'm not sure, but these are so fundamental that we need to focus on them and have a clear objective, not for the next year, 3 years, 10 years, but for the next 100 years, and having that intergenerational perspective when it comes to things like health, education, housing. Just throwing it out there as a concept or an idea, I'm keen for your thoughts on that topic.
Let me play devil's advocate. And the reason I want to play devil's advocate is because we don't know for sure what kind of health, education, infrastructure policies will work in a future that's unpredictable. So when it comes to the contest of ideas for solutions, I want to have that political contest, I want to have the confrontation, I want to have search for better. So politics, I think, is a good democratic process is searching for better solutions. Unfortunately, right now, I don't think we have a search for better solutions. I think we have a search for trying to revert back to history. We're trying to put it on rose-tinted glasses and say the 1960s were better, or the 1980s were better, or the 2000s were better, and that's a problem. So I think when it comes to where I think we need some non-partisanship is in the vision of success. Those 2 mountains I've left up there, it's being able to agree what does that success of infrastructure, housing, education looks like. I don't think it comes from politicians per se, but it comes from us. I think the public has to agree on what that looks like, and I don't think we're sufficiently engaged to be able to articulate what that looks like. Our vision of prosperity for health, education, infrastructure, I don't think these are things that are well understood. I think therein lies the challenge, but I'd be very uncomfortable to live in a well-functioning democracy that doesn't have political discourse, that doesn't have political confrontation. But I think the confrontation needs to be about solutions, but also about when the solutions take place. To give you an example of infrastructure, I'd love for us to have real big fisticuffs that are political about the project that happens in 5 years' time, not the project that happens today, right? I do not want somebody to come into power and go, I'm going to turn off these projects because they were started by the red team and the blue team can't possibly do it. And that's a really big problem, right? So being able to kind of find some way to find consensus on at least some certainty, but good processes, good ways of doing that. So it's a very long answer, but I think the answer lies not in saying, let's take the politics out, but let's bring democracy closer to people. Because I think our political processes have actually moved away from the demos. It's moved away from the people. And therein lies the problem. I think if we have better processes, whatever that might look like, whether it was around the infrastructure and land plans in Canterbury, where people did get involved. Not everyone, but people kind of knew that there was a bit of a fisticuff going on, and people who had strong views got in touch and all that kind of stuff. I think that process is what allows us to find stability. So I'd be very concerned if we somehow did away with the confrontation of politics.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I just think there has to be a way that we could come and have these conversations in a robust way, and then make decisions that are actually going to benefit.
Totally.
Everybody.
It can't be tribal, and I think therein lies the challenges. When it's tribal, it's very difficult for us to have an ability to kind of, you lose face by changing your mind. You lose face if you make a mistake, but if you're not allowed to experiment, if you're not allowed to try things, then how are we going to get better? The fact that our politics and our public services become timid and has become unresponsive is because we're risk averse. risk actually means that it could happen either way, right? It could be good or bad, but we have to learn from it. So I think there's an element of, I don't know what the answer is. I don't feel like my thinking is sufficiently evolved to be able to answer this question well. But I think there's something that's much deeper in terms of this risk aversion, this fear of failure, this inability to fail, that stops us from being able to succeed.
Yeah, having the culture, the ethos of let's try, let's experiment.
But when your society is fractured, you know that if you make a mistake, you're tossed out. There is no second chance. This is it. You failed. You're a bad person. Right? And that's a problem. Like, if you fail, doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means it didn't work. It might have been a mistake, or it was just a thing that wasn't right at the right time. And so therein lies the challenge. Again, I don't know the answer to this, but it feels like we look for these very easy reasons why we can blame somebody. It's the bloody immigrants that cause the problem. Well, is it? Is there a deeper meaning? I don't know. And I think that's the conversation we're not having.
Yeah, that's excellent. One of the things that's underpinning, as we're talking about social cohesion, is the infrastructure side, the building things.
Sure.
I'm just curious, and I think I know what you're going to say, so I'm going to predict superannuation. Like, if we were to change the contribution rates to match what they have in Australia, can you just talk a little bit about that? Because it's something that's frustrated me for a long time. I lived in Sydney for about 4 years, and out of your pay, a portion would go off, and you didn't even really notice that it was gone. But can you just talk a little bit about the difference? Because their rates of contribution are so much higher that literally billions, hundreds of billions that's made up. Can you share about that?
Yeah, look, superannuation is one of those big ones. Like, aging population is a big issue for us, like it is around the world. But to give you some context, unlike every other OECD country, pension liabilities or pension payments in Australia over the course of the next few decades will be falling. Whereas for the rest of us, it's going to be rising to unsustainable levels. And the reason is, from the early 1990s, they moved towards a more means-tested private savings program. It's not perfect by any means. No policy is perfect. But we know that about half, 60% of Australians will be able to pay for their own retirement, and the other 40-50% will need to be supported by aged super. So that's a good thing, right? It means instead of spending $25 billion, as we do in New Zealand today, on superannuation, which people get really upset when I remind them that it's welfare, and the only condition for this welfare is you're going to be old, rather than every other form of welfare where you have to be in poverty. The reality is that we're spending $25 billion a year at the moment in super, which is only going to keep increasing because we've got more people. But we're refusing to actually take steps to help people save more, which would require our contribution rates to increase. QSIP is actually really, really good. I mean, I have to say that because I work at Simplicity. But our contribution rate's only 6% of our income. It really needs to go up to 10-12% for it to actually give us the replacement income by the time we retire. It can be done. If we do it gradually over time, it would work. All we have to do is make it compulsory, and for poor people, we need to make sure that they're able to access it for emergencies that are not so stringent at the moment. So at the moment, it's really difficult for people to access their own money if they're in financial hardship. So these things are possible, and these are small tweaks we could make, but if you don't have social cohesion, it's really hard to make that change because there is a trade-off. And I think this is the big challenge, is our politicians have gotten into the habit of providing us with promises that are undeliverable. We'll tax you less, we'll spend less money, and life will be better. Well, that's not true. That's not true. There are trade-offs in life, and when you have social cohesion, you're able to have those conversations about how do I make certain sacrifices today so that we as a nation are better off and our future generations are better off. And it's very easy to say, but when you're at 50 and you go, if it changes, it's going to be me that's going to be worse off. You don't want to do. So we're kind of stuck in this weird place, right? And which is, at some point in time, we need to have a bipartisan approach to doing that, but I think we've missed that window. Because of the social cohesion, the fracturing that we see, I think we're going to find it very difficult to make progress on these big policy issues. But it's not just superannuation, it's climate change, it's infrastructure, it's health, it's education. All of these things suffer from the same problem, that they require trade-offs. And you know that iron triangle? You can have fast, cheap, or you can have expensive, slow, or crappy. Those are the three choices, right? So because you're choosing between what kind of, how much money you spend, how quickly you do it, and how complicated you make it. So it's a really difficult situation because everybody's promising you unicorns. How many of your local politicians have promised you that rates will increase and everything will be fine? All of them for the last 30 years, right? And these are unrealistic promises, and we pay the price of that now because those promises of low rates were funded by not investing in maintaining our infrastructure. And then now that we have to pay more rates, we're like, oh, aren't those politicians terrible? So I don't know. I haven't answered your question very well, but I feel like there is something, it's a kernel of an idea in all of the rambling.
Yeah, well, I actually don't want an answer. What I want is to provoke thinking so that all of us can grapple with this, because I think that's one of the problems. If somebody says, well, here's the solution, if you don't take everyone on the journey, then it's probably not going to work because there's going to be this accusations back and forth. I want to take a slightly different angle here, thinking about social cohesion and thinking about this place that we're recording this in. So there's a lot of people online, but we're here in Otapaki, Christchurch. And I want to make it really specific for this city. You know it very well, you visit very often, you grew up not far from here. Can you talk to us a little bit about this city? Because you travel, within New Zealand offshore. I'm just curious, particularly for those of us here who live in Otapaki, Christchurch, thinking about the earthquakes, thinking about the shootings, thinking about some of the things that have happened in the last decade-ish. What are some of your thoughts on social cohesion in a city like this?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what we saw in the data, because we can break it down for the region of Canterbury. And what we found was the tolerance for religious diversity was much higher here than in other parts of New Zealand. And I think that's because of what happened with the terrorist shooting here. But sadly, we also see far less cohesion in the local community. We're far less likely to trust our neighbors' neighborhood, feeling connected to our neighborhoods, feeling like our communities are strong. Those kinds of feelings were less positive than other parts of New Zealand. So I was a little bit surprised. I think there was unevenness, and there's also just slightly more anti-immigrant, slightly more racist tendencies in Canterbury than other parts of New Zealand. But that's probably more true of provincial New Zealand in general rather than urban centres. So, some of it was pretty confronting stuff. But it's also the thing about, I did not experience that when I lived here. But clearly people hold some views that they don't necessarily show to your face. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't know. But if you harbor feelings of disconnection, if you harbor feelings of some of those kinds of things, clearly they affect you. But at the same time, I see the data around religious tolerance and being more positive in Christchurch. I see that these experiences are learning experiences for the community. Because when you come together on the back of a crisis, quite often there can be opportunities for positive change.
Well, that's certainly been my experience. I was living offshore when earthquakes happened. My wife and I were debating. I was actually living in Tokyo, which 2 weeks after Christchurch had a massive tsunami, you'll all remember. But when we were debating where should we move when we come back to Aotearoa, we've got 4 young children, and we were looking at the cities, and we thought we're going to make a deliberate choice to move to Otapaki, Christchurch, so that we can be part of building something. So I think there's an interesting element there as well.
And you're not the only one, right,
Yeah.
Stephen? I mean, the population growth that took place after the earthquake was pretty extraordinary. It wasn't just people who were coming to do the rebuild work. It was also all these other people who came because they wanted to be part of rebuilding this place. So there is a lot of, I think, again, we are now veering into some of the positives. I don't think we should assume that we are a polarized and terrible place. We're not. We're talking about tendencies, right? The tendencies that we should make us cautious, but there are also lots of reasons why people feel very connected. So in most measures, I think we'll find in New Zealand, we're probably in that half of our population that are doing pretty well. But it's the other half that's the problem, right? It's this, when you've got this big chunks of society that are kind of feeling disconnected from the opportunities and the blessings that are available, those are the seeds of discontent. And I think that exists here just as it does in other parts of New Zealand.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So this positive framing, let's go there. Thinking about Christchurch in particular, I'm curious, because we're talking about social cohesion, kind of, some of it's at a high level, but let's make it really granular. Like, what is it that builds social cohesion? And particularly, I know some of these people here, they're involved in community groups. There's some people here, philanthropists, they're funding, they're from the city council. like, I'm curious about this. I see Drew and Peach there who helped put on the World Buskers Festival, which was thousands of people coming together, that sense of building community. I just want to read you something. If you're looking for some interesting reading, this is called Bloomsbury South, The Arts in Christchurch, 1933 to 1953. And I found this book to be quite inspirational. So I just want to read you something. So this is going back almost 100 years ago, right? But what was happening in this city? And I think it's part of this social cohesion. For 2 decades in Christchurch, New Zealand, a cast of extraordinary men and women remade the arts. Variously, between 1933 and 1953, Christchurch was the home of Angus, Benson, McCann, Curnow, Goddard, Baxter, the Group, the Caxton Press, the Little Theatre, Menfall Tomorrow, Niall Marsh, Douglas Wilburn. This is the key bit. It was a city in which painters lived with writers, writers promoted musicians, in which the arts and artists from different forms were deeply intertwined. And it just strikes me what a beautiful image of social cohesion that you're talking about, because my imagining would be, imagine if the artist was also talking to the accountant, or the environmental social scientist, or the lawyer, or the economist, and we were able to come together in this city and have a different approach. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. When I talked about positive contact, that's what I was talking about. It's those opportunities for us to meet in safe places to have conversations. And you don't even have to speak directly, just being together in places, sharing spaces is actually really powerful. One of the things that I've been doing some work in Auckland City recently, and one of the big things that I told them was, it's not enough to build public infrastructure. Squares and things are good, but they have to be activated, they need to be fun, they need to be engaging, they need to be places where people hang out and interact with each other. And arts are a beautiful thing. I'm doing some work with Toy Maya at the moment, and it's all around what's the magic of arts and what's the magic of creators? It's that ability to bring people together. It's the ability to reflect society in a different way, right? It's to have the courage to approach some of these difficult topics and conversations. So when it comes to social cohesion, to me, it is about this intertwining of unlikely fellows. And the ability and opportunity for this serendipity is where the beauty of social cohesion takes place. It's not necessarily that you and I catch up regularly, Stephen, which is nice, but we already like each other. That's not the problem. It's that ability to talk to other people who I don't know, whose views might be new to me, their experiences might be new to me. That's where that empathy comes from. That's where our ability to understand differences come from. So look, very hard to answer your very good question, other than to say, at least in my head, what social cohesion looks like are those opportunities for positive contact.
No, that's really helpful, and I just wanted to emphasize it because sometimes when you think about, like, we were talking about infrastructure and superannuation, and it could veer into like the politics and the buildings and things, but actually at a human level, the arts supporting each other, religious activities like sports, community groups, all of these things are building that cohesion to realize, oh, this is someone from overseas, but they're really nice. I can be their friend. Sounds basic, right? But that's important too.
But when I lived here, when I was going to high school, I was at the Hallsville Soccer Club, and you just mix with all these different people. They came from different walks of life, and I mainly went because older people bought me beer, and it was great because I was like rich. But you do these things because you mix with different people, and that gives you a better understanding of what society is like, right? I think one of the guys who used to work there, he used to like run a panel beat, right? And so you kind of mixing with these different people that you would otherwise not necessarily share a beer with, and those opportunities are really positive because he's a genuinely nice guy. It just I would have not met him if I didn't play soccer, right? And so these opportunities, whether it's in religion or whether it's around sporting or social institutions, those are really incredible opportunities, but participation in those things have been falling. So our opportunities for that positive contact have become diminished.
Yeah, no, that's really good. When I send out a follow-up, because we'll have information for you, one of the things I'm going to include is a link to this little book called The Apple Tree, which is something I wrote 2 years ago. It's got illustration. You already got a copy.
I did.
I'll give you another. And I printed 5,000 copies. I think there's about 1,000 left, and I used it as a way to encourage people. But it's amazing how something, picture book, the arts, like it communicates at a really deep level. This could be a textbook that nobody would read, but maybe they'll read this. And so I think it's just encouraged. It's important for us not to just build up the business side or think about it's all about the economy. It's also about the personal side, it's about the arts, it's about sports and connecting as well. So
last night when we were talking about this issue, there was a lot of discussion around people going, okay, give me the idea of what I can do. And I'm like, I don't know. What can you do? Why don't you tell me what you can do? What's one action you can take? And some people got really frustrated with it. It's like, can't you just give me the answer? It's like, but I don't know what it is that in your personal circumstances that you can do. Each of us play different roles. The reason why I did this work is because as an economist, with friends who are philanthropists, this is something I can do that other people can't do. So this is my contribution. But there are contributions that you can make, that are very individual and specific to you. And I think that's the invitation, is to think about what's the one thing you can do, and it's unique to you.
Yeah. Takeaway for everybody here and online. I want to give a shout out to Magda and Jack over here who helped to organize behind the scenes, and so he's just handed me his phone so I can see the chat. There's a question there. If you do have a question and you're online, feel free to type it in the chat, and then Magda has a microphone, so I'm going to ask if anybody would like to ask a question. We've got a question here though from Nelson. So this is Tina Korowa, Stephen, and Shamubeel. What do you think are the key elements of effective social cohesion? How do you measure this as a business case to attract sustainable funding for community projects? Nami nui ko mari aho.
What a great question. The reason why we did this work is so that we could understand what is the state of social cohesion, but you'll see from the data, it's dispersed and it's broad. And that's what makes it very difficult to turn it into a quantifiable measure. That you could say, I did this one action, and as a result, the social cohesion in our community increased. That attribution is very difficult. I think what you can do is go, here's an element of social cohesion that we're really concerned about in our community. That's why we're going to take this action, and we'll measure the specific outcomes of that one project or one action.
Right.
So I think it is about being very specific, as we are in any social good project, is being really deliberate and clear about our intervention logic and measuring our activities and doing that soft qualitative stuff to make sure that we are understanding whether or not it's working, and if not, try and fix it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. All right, we've got a question in the audience. Go ahead, please. Let us know who you are and what your question is.
Yeah, the three circles you mentioned, the first one is the things that you want to get rid of. What's your top candidate from history or across the world that, in terms of policy, that decrease the social coherence? I give you my candidate, maybe please correct me, and I'd like to hear yours. The one I observed is that the identity politics. I'm learning history, and I found a pattern which is no matter where, no matter when, across history, across the world, when a country is playing the identity card too hard, the social coherence decreases. Whenever a country downplays the identity card, the society becomes more harmonious. I can give tons of examples, like South Africa. Before Nelson Mandela, there was apartheid. After when Nelson Mandela came out, he was downplaying the identity card. He emphasized reconciliation, and he specifically mentioned that we don't have to have only the black people in charge. He's downplaying the racial card. But now, that's why later the South Africa has a golden age, has become the BRIC country. But nowadays, it's the reverse racism taking control. I saw a video, it's the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighter. They were publicly chanting, kill the white people. And I just have come in with someone from South Africa. She told me that 70,000 white people have been killed, and nobody cares except Donald Trump.
Okay, well, that's a good question. Any thoughts there, Shamubeel?
I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg as well. Like, does the identity politics become prominent in communities that are less cohesive or more polarized? And then, if it is polarized, what are the kinds of leadership we can have to be able to change it? And when I mentioned the kinds of solutions that we see in the literature, The first one I talked about was leadership. Do our leaders sow division, or do they try and improve things, statesmanship? And so that is one of the solutions, but it's not enough on its own. So you will know that in South Africa, that unity has not been enduring and has not been smooth. It's been uneven. And partly it's because it wasn't just about a leader, you also have to change the culture of the place and the institutions and all of those kinds of things, and that's difficult. So, look, I don't have a good answer for you, but other than to say that I think it's a little bit chicken and egg, that places where societies are already polarized tend to find the use of that into politics, because that is a reflection of the polarization in the community.
Great. All right. Another question?
Yeah, hi. With your two, first of all, this has been fantastic research. Thank you so much. It is so helpful for us. You talked about we don't need converting, we need conversing, which I completely agree. But could I add, we also need concrete outcomes. And when we talk about better processes, what we see is communities get pulled into conversations, and maybe blue sky thinking and this and that, but it doesn't end up being concrete outcomes. It doesn't build trust. It actually does the opposite.
Totally.
And can I just add to that something concrete, especially for funders here, is so I'm working with frontline grassroots community groups at the moment, doing a bit of research. We really need, if you're thinking about social cohesion, it's not necessarily a new project, it's like our ongoing youth workers, community workers, building safe spaces, we're doing ongoing relationship building. We really need funding for our frontline workers.
Excellent. Look, can I just say, particularly the last point, I completely agree. There is amongst philanthropists like politicians, there is a tendency towards ribbon cutting. We must have the sexiest new project to fund, right? And there is actually lots of good stuff that happens, whether it's a women's shelter or whether it's the YMCA. There's lots of really great things we should keep going, because you know what? These are proven solutions that we need to make sure, because they're part of the social infrastructure. That's what catches people between the cracks. But when I talk about good process, I do include following through. It's not just consultation for the sake of consultation. Consultation is not good process. The reason why I mentioned the Christchurch example, the Canterbury example of land and infrastructure, was because they executed on the plan that had been built up with the community. And I think that built a lot of trust in Canterbury through that period of the rebuild. That it wasn't actually some Wellington thing that was imposed on Canterbury. Some of it was, but not all of it. And that it actually worked. And they could see houses being built. They could see the infrastructure built. And to me, that ability to do the full circle, that's absolutely critical. That's what gains trust over time. And I think we talked about this already, that earning trust takes time, but losing trust is very quick.
Yeah. Thank you. Have two more.
Great.
Hi Shamubeel, thank you so much for presenting your research findings. I have a maths question. In the context of New Zealand's tax code, where income is taxed at a higher rate than corporate tax, and where there is no capital gains tax and no wealth tax, it's a mathematical impossibility for people to get ahead. And when we talk about poverty being the reason why there was a breakdown in social cohesion, with the way the economics of personal taxation works, like I said, it's just a mathematical impossibility. So what can we do with that?
Well, good question. We can reform our tax system if we want to, but we actually have to want to. And every time we try, we go, no, actually we'd rather have a tax cut. So, that's social cohesion at work, or the lack of social cohesion at work. When push comes to shove, we don't actually want the infrastructure built. We don't actually want the hospitals. What we actually want is $74 more in our bank. So, we vote with our conscience, right? Sir.
Yeah. You mentioned the earthquake. Immediately after the earthquake, half our buildings in Canterbury were muttered, and NGOs who had previously competed for funding and for clientele moved into the same offices together and shared with other donors. Our ability for social cohesion is hindered by government funding that set NGOs against NGOs, services against services. How can we build a cohesive rangatahi when the funding stream divides?
Really great question, and I think you don't have to be divided. So it is true that post the 1980s, we've taken a view when it comes to public policy that competition is good in everything. But actually, competition is not necessarily the answer when there is no profit to be made. And in charitable works and in philanthropic work, competition doesn't actually work as well as co-opetition does, which is around competition of ideas, but cooperation on delivery. And what we did see after the earthquake is a great coming together of many like-minded people, and they did work together. To give you an example, we are seeing some of these collectives happening still in philanthropy, and that's good. But there is still, I think, way that philanthropies are set up can still create a little bit of a difficulty where there is a single purpose or a single aim that makes it difficult for us to pool our resources together to be able to work in the same direction. But fundamentally, I think what we're talking about is coming together to go, what is our shared vision of the outcome, and where can we find our own places within that, rather than trying to divide and conquer. Because that thinking is zero-sum thinking, that if you win, I lose, versus saying if we work together, we both win and we multiply our outcome. And I think there is a little bit of that abundance thinking that we need to come to, that when we work together and cooperate, actually we can get better outcomes than when we go alone.
We've got 2 more questions here, so why don't we go to this?
With respect to the fact that you said next year it's from your why research, I'm interested in how we got to a place where somebody wants to send us all up some tax cuts more than they want to social cohesion. You mentioned folk who are like looking backwards, like wouldn't it be great if we were 6 years again? Any thoughts to how we got to this place in respect of those pieces? And a cynic could say that there are perhaps some parts of our society that don't particularly want social cohesion for some particular reason. How did that happen?
Yeah, look, a good question, and I don't know the answer. And so we've got 5 years of this research funded. Next year, this year was really to kind of go, does anybody care about this type of work? Because I didn't know if anybody would be interested. So first year was to go, how are we doing relative to Australia? The second year, I'm going to go and raise some women to be able to do the focus groups to understand not only what do people say, but why is it that they feel this way? So you're absolutely right, we need to understand the why, but I don't know yet. Hopefully you'll come back next year and I'll be able to share with you what we found.
All right, we've got 1 more question there.
Kia ora, thank you so much. I'm interested in the chicken and egg where you talked about, there's a voting to see what wants in their pocket, but also begging politicians substantially for promising those kind of things. How do we get away from that? And how do we give our politicians the mandate to have those tough conversations in a more nuanced way, where they don't feel like they have to just promise rates reduction to get elected?
Really great question. I don't have a good answer for you because I know.
I need to know for this year.
Yeah, I know.
It's a conversation I'm hoping to have.
I don't have a good answer for you, and the reason why I don't have a good answer for you because I don't think the public is ready to contemplate that there's a trade-off.
They need to be.
Absolutely, but you're not going to get elected when you say there is a trade-off, that there is a cost to this thing. And I think therein lies the thing is when somebody promises you a unicorn, you like the person. But there is no reality, and the lack of critical analysis of the promises that are being made, it does not get through. So even when you come and say, these set of policies that your politicians have put forward cannot add up, New Zealanders don't believe you. Right? So when the last elections were taking place, I did exactly that. Did anybody believe me? No. Oh no, what does he know? Well, guess what? The numbers don't add up.
Like it's close, right? Like it's that, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is I think, yes, you're right, it's hard because you can't do it on your own. You need the support of a credible, independent media and experts who are able to put it in a way that people trust, but people don't trust those institutions, and hence, even if you have experts, they're not independent, credible. So we're kind of stuck in this trap at the moment, and I don't know how to overcome the bridge. I feel like we're stuck. Like I can convince half of the people, but not the other half.
I know there's going to be lots of questions, so we're going to stick around a little bit after this. You can come up and have a chat with Shamubeel. I want to kind of round it off just by thinking I've been doing a lot of more work with iwi-based clients, and it's been really interesting for me coming from a Pākehā perspective to talk to them about the 500-year vision, the 500-year plan. Just wonder, that element we hadn't touched on, so I'm just curious, any thoughts on that? Because that, to me, that comes down to the heart of the intergenerational perspective. And also it's looking at your whakapapa, where am I from, as a representative today to build a future for those coming. Any thoughts you can share on that?
Absolutely. So that picture that you see behind me, that picture of the mountain Fotuhoi, can you see that river?
Yeah.
So that river not only represents a river, it also represents time. So it's the connection of, when it comes to tikanga, it's that ability to think about yourself as a product of everything that has come before and everything that will come afterwards. So what we're observing today as humanity is the river passing by, right? That's what we think of as the orthodox way of thinking about the world. But for when you take a tikanga perspective, you are the river. You are the embodiment of the past and the future. And that's really important because it says, when we are thinking about prosperity, are we thinking about prosperity with a telescope with our eye today looking to the future? Or is it us standing at the future and looking back to asking, what kind of choices should I have made 100 years ago? The answers are completely different. One is about the positive choices that you make today, and the other is about how can I get the most out of the decisions I make today. They're quite different things because the people that you're trying to maximize it for is for either future generations or the generations today. The reason why the iwi thinking, the tikanga thinking is so different is because it's reversed in terms of the priorities. It's community first, where the individuals succeed, rather than a community is a sum total of individuals. And the reality is that no community is the sum total of individuals. The community is much greater than a sum of the individuals. There is the magic of us doing things together. There is a superpower in that. That's why we do things together. That's why we have collectives. And that's really baked into the articulation of what tikanga is. That's really baked into the articulation of what society is and what success looks like. I don't think we're quite ready to confront that yet, but there is something really beautiful in the conversation. But until you have that articulation, I think it's very difficult to say, I'm going to make sacrifices today for the people who are going to come in 100 years' time. Because inevitably the question becomes, what cost am I willing to bear for somebody I will never meet? So,
no, I love the framing. I think that's a good way to finish up because it is asking us a question as individuals and collectively as a group, that intergenerational perspective, that 50 years from now, or 100 years from now, or 500 years from now, it does frame things differently because all of a sudden the priorities are shifting. And I've recently been reflecting, I'm now in my middle years, right? Like many of us here. I won't be here forever, and I'm starting to think about myself when I'm hopefully 85 or 90, and that's me too. It's a future version of me, but what choices am I making today to become that person? And I think that's something that we can each sit with. But then as a society as well, we need to ask that question.
Can I just give some very practical things? If you're thinking about yourself at the age 85, you hope that your aged care work is paid really, really well and is well rested. Your nurse is really well paid, and your hospital is working really, really well. So, I've seen this with my parents, when you're not doing so well, those people, they pull out all the stops. They're the superheroes.
Yeah. Well, I think we can all agree this has been fascinating. I knew this would happen. It's just back and forth. There's so many ideas. That's why I've always loved listening to you and hearing you. I'm sure I can talk to people in Christchurch and maybe we can have you come back and do some follow-up on different themes, maybe obviously next year, but maybe even before then, because this is the type of conversation we need to have as a city, as a society. So thank you so much for coming and joining, and let's give Shamubeel.